Hey there, it's me, Atheist Morph, and I'm going to do a second part on Bob Bunnell. Now, I wasn't planning to do this, but there's been some subsequent stuff from Bob that I feel needs commenting on. And the first thing I'm going to do is revisit the Gospels. Now, in the first part, I did quite a long section on the Gospels with Bob, and if you'll remember, Bob made the claim that Mark, Matthew, Luke and John were written by Mark, Matthew, Luke and John. I tried to put across the point of view that most scholars and historians don't actually hold that view. And I pressed Bob to come up with a peer-reviewed source that actually says that Mark, Matthew, Luke and John were written by Mark, Matthew, Luke and John. Now, he hasn't quite managed to do this, but he did finally come up with a name. And in this tweet, that's where he comes up with the name. Dr. Daniel Wallace, who is a foremost scholar. Now, it may well be that Wallace is very well qualified in this field. I don't see how it's relevant that he goes around the world taking photographs of stuff. I mean, if I went around the world taking photographs of buildings, would I become, the world's greatest architect? But anyway, it turns out that Dr. Wallace says that Mark, Matthew, Luke and John were written by Mark, Matthew, Luke and John. So how well does this stand up? And as Bob asked me here, do I have to be a judge of scholarship? How difficult is it to actually look at Wallace's claims and see whether they hold water? So at this point, we got a response from Lilith, liberated. Now, Lilith, many of you follow, and if you don't, you really should. Follow her on Twitter. She has her own YouTube channel, and she's a regular contributor to both Gonna Go For It and Veritas Voices. And I really suggest you follow, because this lady knows an awful lot about the Bible, Bible history, and so on. It's looking into that turned her from being a fundamentalist Christian to being an atheist. So first of all, Lilith asks him if he's still lying about the Gospels. Well, is Bob lying or not? It may be something that he genuinely believes. But Bob, would you not like to believe things that are true? You should really look into the facts behind all of your truth claims. If you just want to believe it, in the teeth of every piece of evidence, how is that honest to yourself? Lilith points out that there seems to be a bit of an absence of actual published peer-reviewed work from Wallace. Now, I'm not saying there isn't any, but a cursory search that I did found nothing really other than what Lilith found here, which is that he falsely ascribed a section of what appears to be one of the Gospels to the 1st century, whereas later dating actually showed it came from the 2nd or 3rd century. Now, I did find reference to that in a Wikipedia page. Now, just read what it says in this Wikipedia page. Does that sound like Wallace made this claim and then tried to cover it up, make sure that nobody else could investigate it, and find out that his claim was actually false? Bob, is this the guy that you really want to cite as your expert? That Mark, Matthew, Luke and John wrote Mark, Matthew, Luke and John? It doesn't sound like he's a really good source. So Lilith then tweeted again about this, and she pointed out that Wallace actually works at a seminary. Now, this is a bit like people working for AIG. When they work for AIG, it doesn't matter what they actually know to be true or what they can actually show to be true. They have to actually publish stuff that's in line with AIG's views. Wallace has to be in line with the views of the seminary, whether or not he actually holds those views privately. And he would keep what he thought privately if it was different, very quiet. So he works somewhere that actually requires him to say that Mark, Matthew, Luke and John were written by Mark, Matthew, Luke and John. Doesn't that call into question what he's saying? Anyway, Bob couldn't take the truth bombs, and after just these 2 tweets, he muted Lilith, and me shortly after. Now, you can just Google Daniel Wallace and find the bio, and the guy that he's actually talking about is Daniel B Wallace. I did a search for Daniel Wallace peer-reviewed publications and came up with absolutely nothing, other than for a Daniel J. Wallace, who appears to have made great contributions to medical science. The only publications I can find for Daniel B. Wallace appear to be a series of books he's written for people like Bob, who just basically buy all of his bullshit. Now I'm just going to finish this section with Lilith's last point. There has been an awful lot of scholarship in this area, and these people are smart and spend their lives studying this stuff. And they learn a lot about writing styles and about ancient languages, and are able to discern, not always crystal clearly, what is a genuine historical document from what is a forgery working towards some sort of agenda. So we're going to move on, and this one I wanted to put in part 1, but part 1 was starting to get a bit long, so I'm going to deal with it now. And that's this fallacy that Bob perpetrates, and he's not alone in this, the whole Hitler, Stalin, Mao, and all the people that they killed in the 20th century. And they were atheists. Well, it's unclear exactly what Hitler's views were, because there's times when he, speaks against religion, but there's times when he also uses religion in his favour. But that's all by the by, really. I think that there's a red herring going on here, because none of these people did what they did because they were atheists. And it's easy to point to religious people who carried out atrocities as well. What about the Crusaders and the Inquisition? Can you honestly think what the Crusaders would have done if they'd had modern assault rifles and modern military logistics? They would have killed many, many more people than they did. And what would be the state of the Middle East now had they had those things at their disposal? Anyway, as I said, it's a total red herring, because they didn't do what they did because they were atheists. But let me concede that point, Bob. Let's say they did do what they did because they're atheists. Does that come any closer to proving that your God is true? At the very best, all it can do is show that belief in God might be a good thing, whether or not that God is true. What you're doing here is what's known as an appeal to consequences fallacy. Let me give another example to illustrate that. Very often after school shootings in the US, I see US politicians, or maybe some of these big mega preachers, saying that the reason that school shootings happen is that evolution is taught in schools. If that's true, and I doubt very much that it is, but if it is true, let's grant you again that it's true that school shootings happen because they teach evolution in schools. Does that make evolution false? All of this peer-reviewed science that's been done that shows that evolution is true, does that just go out of the window because of the consequences of believing in it? Absolutely not. Not unless you're using some sort of Jordan Peterson version of true. And I don't use that. When I use the word true, I mean concordant with known facts. And while we're on this tweet, Bob, you talk about false religions. Well, John Loftus talks about the outsider test for faith. Now, I'm an outsider. I don't believe your religious claims, or anybody else's. So how can I tell? How can I tell what's a true religion and what's a false religion? Can you please give me a test for that? And can I just say, Bob, on the basis of all the other fallacious things you've said, your say-so is probably not going to qualify as that test. Can I just say that this is something I see from theists quite a bit. Bob, over the years you've been on Twitter and any other media that you use, I'm sure you've had it pointed out to you that you're doing an appeal to consequences fallacy, and the argument actually doesn't hold water. But you keep on using it, and you muted me, but I've looked in on other discussions, and I can see you still using the same fallacious arguments that you've had pointed out to you. It indicates a certain lack of honesty, and I see this quite often from theists, and that's something that should make you think. When you see one side being mainly honest and saying, I don't know, when they don't know, and the other side just basically making stuff up and continuing to use arguments they've been shown are bad, does that not make you think that one side is a lot more honest than the other? And what I see is the atheists being honest, despite the fact that the theists have actual commandments telling them that they've got to be honest. So is lying for Jesus okay? But my point is on this, that I used to use, when talking about evolution, ring species as an example. And then somebody pointed this article out to me by Jerry Coyne. Now, it's quite a long article, and Jerry Coyne says that the lack of true ring species doesn't in any way decrease the case for evolution. However, I never used ring species again after reading this article. Now, while we're talking about consequences, here's another case of a young chap who's being killed because his father believes absolute nonsense. I mean, how many people in 2019 do actually believe in demons? If you ask me, far too many. The germ theory of disease has been about for a long time now, and it's about time everybody accepted it. The demon theory of disease belongs to a bygone age. Now, what I'm saying here, is that an appeal to consequences? I mean, this guy believes that his son was possessed by a demon, and he ended up drowning the kid trying to get rid of the demon. Well, that is a consequence. So maybe I am using the same fallacy here, but I'm not using it to try and show the existence or non-existence of God. I'm just using it to try and show that holding certain beliefs have consequences, and those consequences can be dire. Now, finally, Bob, we're talking about evidence again. And you say that you do provide evidence to some atheists who you think have an open mind. Now, I started this discussion with you and you just cut it short. Bob, do you not think that we should believe things and accord them a level of confidence commensurate with the amount of evidence for those things? Now, seeing many of your tweets, this is how you define an open mind. You think that you have an open mind. You believe in your God and Jesus and all these other things that have very sketchy evidence. And because of them, you don't accept things like evolution, which have absolute mountains of evidence. Is that truly open-minded? The way I would define open-minded is that you will listen to what people are saying and then accord the confidence in what they're saying to the evidence provided for it, or the evidence that you can find for it. And Bob, every single time you make a claim, it's a logical fallacy or something that can be Googled in 5 minutes and found to be untrue. So I think, like many theists, what you actually have is the idea of open-mindedness completely turned on its head. We've got to be open to all of your fallacies We've got to be open to believing the Bible, even though it's wildly contradictory and says things like bats are birds and a man had strength in his hair. And we're supposed to accept what it says on other things, even though it's so vastly wrong on things that we actually know. So Bob, I'm just going to put it to you that it's you that aren't open-minded. You have a worldview that's been boxed in by your belief in your God, and that the Bible is true, and that Jesus was a real thing that actually came to earth and, was crucified for our sins and all that sort of stuff. There's very little evidence that any of that is true. And because of it, you reject stuff that are scientific facts. Is that open-mindedness?